All right, welcome back, everyone. Appreciate the remarks from Stu. So we've heard from PJM, and now we're going to hear from the PJM Market Monitor. Dr. Joseph Bowring is president of Monitoring Analytics, and as the independent market monitor for PJM, is responsible for all market monitoring activities of PJM interconnection. He has extensive experience in applied energy and regulatory economics, a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts. He served as senior staff economist for the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities and as the chief economist for the New Jersey Department of the Public Advocates Division of Rate Counsel. And I can just say that at our last states only meeting back in May, Dr. Bowring came and talked to the state commissioners and is now back on command performance because that was such a good and valuable discussion for all of us. So I know he's going to give us the same today. So we're really pleased to have Dr. Bowring here. And he will take questions during the course of his talk. So if you have them, just raise your hand and we'll get around with a microphone. Dr. Bowring?
Thank you. So I guess Stu and I agree on a lot of things, but you're not going to know it after today. So seriously, if people want to give me a hard time while I'm talking, that's great. Liven things up a little bit. You all look pretty alert, so let's see how that goes. So I'm not going to go through all this. I have a bunch of slides. I'm not going to go through them all. They'll be available for you to look at afterwards. They'll be made available. I put some slides at the beginning about market monitoring because not everybody knows exactly what it is we do. But one of the things to know about market monitoring is that we are committed to defending competitive markets. That's one of our key functions. We are committed to defending competitive markets. But to get to the substance, so narratives define how we look at these issues, how we look at market issues. It's essential that we define the narrative, whichever it is, that's based on facts. So we need to understand the details of the problems and issues before attempting to solve them. Seems like an obvious point, but not one that's always followed. So, and I've got my map at PJM too, Stu. So even though you can't read this, this actually shows the relative share of revenues from the various markets, from capacity energy and ancillary services and others. Transmission, let's not forget transmission. We're not really talking about it today, but competition and transmission is also key. So the first question is, what's the problem? There are lots of proposals to change markets, PJM markets, pretty dramatically, but what's the problem? So we know that gas is cheap and volatile. We know that energy prices are low. In fact, in 2016, PJM prices were lower than they ever had been in the history of PJM, and in 2017, next lowest. So prices are low. Although in 2018, prices are up 30% first 3 quarters over the prior 3 quarters. Capacity prices have been moderate. Overall costs have been low. As I do agree with Stu, markets have worked. Costs of providing power have been less, significantly less than they would have been under cost of service regulation. Fuel diversity is up. New combined cycles are profitable. We continue to get entry and exit. So again, what's the problem? Well, some units are uneconomic. Many units have retired. Others are getting retirement signals. And what's the definition of a retirement signal in a market? If you're not covering your going forward costs. It's not that you're not earning your rate of return, it's that you're not covering your going forward costs. That's a definition in a market, a standard economist definition of when you're receiving a signal to retire. And in the slides I show how that varies by unit type. And in general, units in PJM require both the capacity market revenues and energy market revenues in order to stay in the market, in order to cover their avoidable costs. One of the things we know is that the significant level of coal in PJM is uneconomic. And just so we see, and these are the prices, so you can see that they were very low in 16 and 17, lower than any other time, and have gone up a bit in 2018. But part of the reason for some of the controversy is that, and here we see fuel generation by fuel source remains quite diverse. Part of the reason for controversy in PJM is that some units are receiving retirement signals. A large number of coal plants are receiving retirement signals, and some nuclear power plants are receiving retirement signals. Although it's a relatively small number, and they tend to be only single unit stations. There are more units at risk, but interestingly, despite all that, despite their high level of retirements, the reserve margins at PJM are extraordinarily high, almost 30%. So in PJM, reserve margins at 30%, and we have a resilience issue. In ERCOT, they're 8%, and things seem to be fine. Do that math. So what's the problem? I repeat, what's the problem? So there are two broadly competing narratives. So one is, the problem is competition. Competition has been very effective. Competition is dynamic. Competition is disruptive. It's disruptive to the paradigm. It's disruptive to competitors. It's meant low prices, but it's also meant reliability. So competition has been very disruptive, and it has put pressure on units, and that's all true. The other narrative is, well, we see retirements. We see future potential retirements. So resilience is the problem. Somehow when we lose some of these units, in particular, resilience becomes the problem. So the other narrative is focused on resilience, and that starts with coal and nuclear economics. Somehow, again, it's imagined that if coal and nuclear power plants retire, we won't be resilient, we won't be reliable. An indication that there's a reduced diversity of the fuel mix, that we won't be reliable. There's the argument there's over-reliance on gas, that the particular issues are relying on gas, that prices are too low. The second narrative is retirements cause resilience issues. Two different ways of looking at exactly the same problem. And layered on top of that, we have an issue that has been talked about this morning a little bit, which is carbon policies, renewable energy resource mix, particularly policies at the state level. So we have that layered over all of it. So the proposed solutions, not surprisingly, depend on the chosen narrative. So if resilience is the problem, it implies, among other things, direct coal and nuclear subsidies. And we've saw those proposals from DOE, although they seem to be on the defunct at the moment. But we've also seen individual states attempting to subsidize coal and nuclear power plants. A relatively small number of each, but nonetheless we've seen those. And again, that comes out of the narrative about resilience. Another part of it, though, and it's the part we're seeing, it's the part we're seeing in PJM, is another solution to resilience, and it really came from the same source. The resilience issue is to raise energy prices. So PJM's goal, whether it's through convex hull pricing, or the ORDC that Sue talked about, the demand curve, or fast start pricing, or adding things to the energy offers in the form of variable O&M, are all efforts to make the energy price higher, which is seen as necessary to keep some of the units around that would otherwise retire. In addition, another part of the set of solutions is to identify issues with gas. Gas is subject somehow to security issues that other fuels are not. And it's also to reduce and change the role of the capacity market. One of the proposals has been, and we'll see, is really to apply an IRP type approach to the capacity market to actually decide what forms of technology are going to be accepted, as PJM did with demand side for a while, to actually pick levels of resources and ensure that some level of every type of resource is purchased rather than letting the market pursue it. I think the other way of looking at it is that if we were to start off today from scratch, nobody would build nuclear power plants, nobody would build coal plants, they're not economic. We'd build gas and we'd build renewable, and we figure out how to make it work. And from the competitive perspective, from the narrative based on competition, that's what we should be thinking about. So if we think competition is the problem, it implies also a set of solutions. So we need to continue to refine the competitive market rules. The rules are complicated. They need to get better. There are particular areas that can be made better in, but it does not require a radical and wholesale comprehensive change to either the capacity market or the energy market. As Stu was suggesting, I agree. We need to price operator actions. We need to make sure that when operators put on a bunch of units for reliability, that does not suppress the price, particularly at a time when we should be raising the price. So when we're short, when we're facing a hot day or a cold day and operators put on additional units, prices should be higher, not lower. At the moment, they are lower. That should not be the outcome. And our response to PJM's operating reserve demand curve is, yes, we need to price operator actions. We believe PJM's operating reserve demand curve will raise prices very dramatically into the tune of something like $2 billion a year, raise prices almost all the time, when in fact what we need to do is make it more targeted, make price increases targeted when necessary on actions which which reflect the underlying supply and demand fundamentals. If we're short, prices should be high. If we're scarce, prices should be high. PJM has had very, very few scarcity pricing events, many fewer than actual scarcity would indicate. Not quite sure why that is, but scarcity pricing is part of pricing, and we shouldn't be allergic to scarcity pricing. We do need to address fuel supply issues. There are certainly issues about gas that need to be addressed. The business models of the gas pipeline industry and the merchant wholesale power industry don't mesh very well. I've said this repeatedly. I don't think there are any gas pipeline people in the room, so I don't have to duck, but I frequently talk about a gas ISO. There's no reason, there are good reasons to think about. If we were proceeding from scratch today, we'd be thinking about that. We'd be thinking about why is it that we don't have interoperability among all the different pipelines, why we don't have a network of gas pipelines, why that wouldn't be an equally profitable and actually more reliable approach for the intersection of the gas industry, the gas pipeline network, and the power network. We should also let uneconomic units retire. If units are uneconomic, subject to the normal reliability checks that PJM does, they should be allowed to retire. There's no reason to keep units around because we like a particular technology, we like a particular unit. And of course, we also need to continue to refine capacity market rules, and I'll talk about that for a moment. Okay, I guess I haven't said anything controversial enough to evoke a question. That's good. So in the capacity market, we need to address this combination of issues. So we need to address how competition works, and we need to also address the growing state role, particularly in the area of renewables. So as we all know, in the PJM footprint, many of the states, although not all, have strong and growing stronger RPS standards, renewable portfolio standards, which require some level of renewable resources. That's clearly a substitute for the lack of a federal or even a regional carbon policy. And one of the things I've been suggesting for a while, and hopefully will happen, is that PJM revive its carbon plan modeling, show all the states exactly what would happen with carbon prices, or if you had a different range of carbon prices, what would happen with dispatch, what would happen with tax revenue, and let the states sit in a room and see if you all can work something out that makes sense, that makes everybody better off, and is better off than a patchwork of RPS standards, many of which price carbon at multiples of what anyone thinks is the social price of carbon. In some states, we have implied carbon prices of $300 and $400. In others, we have carbon prices of just a few dollars. And pretty clearly, that doesn't make sense. So while a carbon price, from an economist's perspective, obviously would be a good thing, that's the state's decision. And if the states choose not to go there, we still have to address the implications on the capacity market from strong RPS standards, which we need to do. So at the moment, renewables have had a tiny impact in PJM. Total renewables are 3 or 4% total output, even a smaller proportion of capacity when you take capacity as being what's there reliably on peak. So I know there's been a lot of opposition over the years to capacity markets because they seem as if somehow they're just adding a cost, but of course they're not. And customers are going to pay for capacity and energy. They're going to pay for the entire cost of power plants no matter what. They're going to pay for them whether you pay for them through the capacity market, whether you pay for them through high energy prices, whether you pay for them in side payments, they are going to be paid for. And the question is, what's the best and most competitive way to do that? I would argue that, and I am arguing that capacity market is the most efficient competitive way to do that. It's more competitive and more efficient, for example, than an all-energy market. All energy markets are not somehow magical, laissez-faire, economist dream markets. In fact, quite the reverse. They are every bit as administrative, in fact, more administrative than capacity markets. Texas is shifting its demand curve out because revenues weren't high enough. That's not a theoretically based approach, that's just a fact, and it just shows you that it's administrative, subjective, and would you rather have your prices and total revenues that you're paying as customers be set by a subjective standard or set through the more objective standard of capacity markets, recognizing that capacity markets, if you came upon them cold, would strike you as horribly convoluted and bizarre, but nonetheless, and that's I'm saying that to you, but nonetheless, they are a more competitive way to structure it than an all-energy market. So how's the capacity market going to deal with high levels of renewables? I think first of all, the point is that if we have high levels of renewables, the first place that effect is going to be felt is in the energy market. So as Stu pointed out, higher levels of zero marginal cost energy. That will tend, everything else equal, to reduce energy prices. But if we also need thermal resources to be around for reliability, for ramping, as is even the case in California, we need to make sure that the thermal resources that we need, not more, but the thermal resources we need are paid. And the capacity market plays that key equilibrating function for the thermal resources we need. We define the level of reserves and capacity we need, and as revenues from the energy market go down, the required revenues of the capacity market go up. So the capacity market can and has and will serve that equilibrating function. So then to talk a little bit about some of the issues that hopefully because no one's going to run out of the room when I talk about this, to talk about the issues that have been characterized as about MOPR. We have taken a step back and tried to think about those issues, tried to think about how the capacity market works with the energy market and works with states' clear desire to have higher levels of renewables, and modified our proposal in the last go-around in front of FERC. So instead of focusing, and I think it's appropriate not to focus, instead of focusing, as had been the case in the prior MOPR rules, on assertions about market power, we're simply saying that the issue has to do with non-market revenues. It's market revenues and non-market revenues. It's not accusing anyone of exercising market power. We believe the states are well-intentioned in doing whatever it is that they want to do on renewables. But nonetheless, it has to be equilibrated. We think the approach we're talking about harmonizes the two. And one of the key realizations we came to in thinking about it more is the point of MOPR was to require competitive offers from all resources, from resources that are subsidized, resources that are not subsidized. And then the question is, what is the definition of a competitive offer in the capacity market? Without getting too deep into the arcana, under the MOPR rules, it was always defined as the net cost of new entry. That is, taking account of all your costs, 20-year levelized, all your costs, net of net revenue. But in fact, that's not the definition of a competitive offer in the capacity market, as those are defined in PJM. In fact, it's net avoidable cost, which is a much lower number. So the net cost of new entry approach served to keep units out, which was the design, but it's also not competitive offer and is an anti-competitive barrier. If you simply want to prevent subsidized units from entering the market, you have to prevent subsidized units from entering the market. You cannot do it by raising and redefining the competitive offer. But the point is, if you define the competitive offer properly, then the impact of the rules on renewable resources in particular changes quite significantly. It's very different to look at the net avoidable cost of a solar resource or wind resource than it is to look at the net cost of new entry. And in fact, based on our analysis, the impact on renewables would be zero or very little. The only possible swing would be some offshore wind, but even offshore wind on an avoidable cost basis is likely to clear given most capacity market clearing prices. Interestingly, the same thing is true of economic nuclear power plants. If you're economic, that is, if you're more than covering your avoidable costs, which most nuclear power plants are, then you can also make a competitive offer in the capacity market and clear. So the point about this approach is that it does harmonize with renewable resource standards. It is consistent with increasing levels of renewables providing energy. It's consistent with larger levels of lower cost energy, but also is consistent with maintaining reliability by ensuring that the revenues are there for the thermal resources and other more traditional resources, the horse and buggy resources, that are necessary in order to maintain reliability. So this is just, we've started publishing this every quarter. This shows all the nuclear power plants, all based on public data, all the nuclear power plants in PJM on a forward-looking basis, whether they're more than covering their avoidable costs or not. So a shortfall is you're not covering your avoidable costs. Surplus is you're more than covering your avoidable costs. As you can see, there are only a couple of units out of the multiple units in PJM that are not covering their avoidable costs, but there are some. In each case, there are single unit stations. There are some, but by and large in PJM, the nuclear power plants are covering their avoidable costs and therefore don't need subsidies and would clear in the capacity market. But just in case you thought we were getting soft in our old age, if units don't clear, then as far as we're concerned, they're not capacity resources, and if states want to maintain them, they're free to do that, but they do not get capacity market revenues. The capacity market does not change. We don't need some hugely complicated, impossible to understand set of rules to make sure they really clear and force out competitive units. If they're not competitive and should not clear. The final piece of our recommendation on all that is if you want to maintain cost of service regulation in the state, that's fine, but rather than acting as if you're a market competitor, you should simply offer in as what's called FRR. So that's the capacity market. Still no questions, okay. On the energy market. So I agree with Stu that the energy market also needs a careful look at. I mean, all the markets need constant review to make sure we're getting competitive outcomes. But rather than saying we need to turn it on its head, or the capacity market revenues are too low, or that energy prices are too low, none of which are true, we do need to focus on getting the details right. There are lots of details in the way the markets work that need fixing, that are not working very well. Just as an example, and Commissioner Glick mentioned this as well, incentives for flexibility. At the moment, we allow units to have massively inflexible parameters. It might take a day or two to start. You may only be able to turn off once a week. And if that's true, you get paid uplift, operating reserves, payment from load for all the hours when you're not economic, but claim you have to be on because of those inflexible parameters. So right from the get-go, we should not be paying uplift to units with inflexible parameters. We need direct incentives for flexibility. Uplift also results from is paid allegedly to units following dispatch. But when we look in detail at what it means to follow dispatch in PJM, it becomes a lot fuzzier than you might imagine. There's significant numbers of units that actually don't get an electronic dispatch signal from PJM. It's very difficult to tell many times whether units really are following dispatch. And when you look at all those details, we've been uncovering case after case where we believe that uplift is being paid, excessive uplift is being paid. So again, that's an area that needs careful attention. And if uplift is one of the problems we're trying to solve with energy market reform, there are ways to do it in a very direct, focused way. So I've mentioned when we're talking about the capacity market, we do need to price operator actions. It's essential that scarcity pricing work, that operators not suppress the price, and that there be an operating reserve demand curve, but it be targeted. It be based on actual historical information. It be based on an analysis of when dispatchers are actually taking action. And the fact that PJM at many times has excess reserves is entirely to be expected. In the morning at the moment, for example, if you have to turn on units that have to be there for later on for the peak, and you have to turn on a unit that has a 12-hour minimum runtime, of course you're going to look long in the morning. That doesn't mean you need to pay them $50 a megawatt hour to be there. Quite the reverse. They're there in part because they're inflexible, they're getting paid uplift to be there, and that's not a sign that the reserve market is broken and needs to be higher prices. It's a sign that we're not giving units the adequate incentive to be flexible, and that, in fact, it does not mean that energy prices need to be higher to cover that. If, however, based on expectations of the operators, they think a cold day is coming, for example, in the polar vortex, or a hot day in the summer, and they turn on 2 or 3 extra units that wouldn't otherwise be on based on the market, that is a reason to shift the demand curve. It is a reason for prices to be higher, and it is a reason for that to affect the energy market price. So, markets have worked. I agree with Stu about that. He talked about the value proposition. Markets have worked. Costs to customers have been low. The markets have been very efficient. They've given efficient entry and exit signals. They've given efficient dispatch signals. The market has worked. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean there aren't problems, but they have clearly worked. And the markets have been both flexible and resilient. As I have said, the question now is not so much about the resilience, the fuel resilience, but whether the market construct itself is going to be resilient in the face of all the attacks on it. The goal of competition, the goal of competitive markets, is to have the lowest possible price. Both words are key. It's the lowest and possible. It can't be below an efficient level, but it has to be as low as possible. That's the goal of competitive markets, and having worked as a regulator, I know that markets are more efficient than regulation, both from looking at data and from personal experience. So we don't need a radical or comprehensive change to the markets. We do need continued focus on the details, continued improvement. Good market design is self-sustaining. And last but not least, I believe that the stakeholder process in PJM, as difficult as it is, has been working just fine, and it does not make sense to give PJM 205 rights over all filings. That's a lower standard than a 206 filing. PJM has 206 rights, as does everyone else, apparently except the market monitoring unit. But the stakeholder process is messy. I sit through it all the time. It could be made more efficient, but real issues are debated, real interests are debated, and from my perspective, it has worked very well. And the fact that it doesn't do what one party or another wants as quickly as they want is not a sign that it's not working, it's a sign that it is working. So now you can ask me some questions. Thank you. Yes.
Dr. Bowring, Jason Stanek, Maryland Public Service Commission. I just wondered if you had any general observations with respect to the capacity market proceeding before FERC right now. A number of us have been losing sleep over this issue for the past 6 months. We recognize that FERC is set to rule hopefully next month with the BRA auctions delayed. And I know there's about a dozen different proposals out there, including one from yourself. Any general predictions about where you think FERC may be going?
Unfortunately, I don't predict FERC very well, and you know why. I haven't been there. So I have hopes. I have hopes that they'll adopt something similar to what we propose. I mean, I never actually dare hope that they'll actually adopt a proposal from us, although that happens once in a while. But there are lots of terrible proposals. There are lots of proposals that make things horribly complicated, that pay opportunity cost units that don't clear, not that I'm picking on anyone particularly with that comment, that actually have, so in some cases there are strong mopers, clean mopers, not so clean mopers. So I mean, I think hopefully the goal of the commission will be to read all 500 filings carefully and to try to come out with something which I think many of the commissioners have said is trying to meet the objectives that I pointed out as well, trying to be consistent with, make sure it works with the energy market, maintains reliability, and is also consistent with the primary state goal, which is increase renewables. You can't deny that exists, as Commissioner LaFleur said. You do need to harmonize with it, and I think the essential point is that it has to work that way. And to me, an essential point has to do with what I said before. It has to do with how you define a competitive offer. PJM is stuck with the old version of competitive offer, and just to be honest here, we were asserting the wrong view about the competitive offer for many years under the MOPR rules as well. But having gone back and thought about it carefully and trying to think about all the current events in that market, we realized that it's not actually based on the current capacity market rules. But that one insight changes the way that MOPR works and makes it much less draconian and much less likely to have a negative effect on the kinds of resources that states are trying to pursue. So that's not a forecast. I have no idea what they're going to do. I know they'll be thoughtful, and we'll see what it is. And now a word from a supporter of capacity markets.
It's not a capacity market question.
All right.
So
Oh.
this is actual real questions.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is not an argument or anything.
I'm
Elise
sorry.
Kaplan, American Public Power Association. So, no, to follow up on the discussions earlier about fuel security, with
Yes.
Commissioner Glick and what Stu Bressler presented, I actually didn't quite hear it in your talk, but do you have any thoughts on this sort of idea of trying to price attributes within the markets, and any thoughts you have on the PJM fuel security study as well?
Yes, I mean, I think the fuel security study attempted to really get at a range of issues, and I think it was well done, and we actually collaborated with PJM on some of it, so small parts of it. So I think fuel security matters. I think defining individual attributes is an engineer's approach to markets. And in fact, interestingly, back in 2007, PJM had initially proposed that there be X amount of nuclear, X amount of coal, X amount of gas, and that they predefine that. That's a mistake. The markets can tell us which is the most economic resource. There's nothing uneconomic, unreliable about any fuel. To the extent we're worried about the deliverability of gas and people are not getting firm gas, you can require people to get firm gas. You can work on whether it's a gas ISO. As I said a minute ago, I think the way to think about it is, let's all take a step back and say, if we were starting from today, how would we make gas reliable for the power grid? We figure out a way to do that. It's not impossible to do. It's not even all that hard if you think about it. I mean, the pipelines are stuck in 50 to 100 years ago, well, probably 50 years ago thinking. They don't want to change, but I think it could be a profitable model for them to work in an ISO kind of framework. But it does have to be addressed, and there are real risks associated with relying on gas, particularly non-firm gas on cold winter days when other people have a primary call on the gas. That's a real issue, but it should be addressed. Rather than demonizing gas, let's just say, what's the issue? How do we price that into the market? So yes, I mean, fuel security, all forms of security make sense. Reliability is something that, as somebody pointed out, NERC and PJM and FERC have been thinking about forever, and we all need to continue to think about it. But it doesn't require a radical change to the market. It requires evolving our thinking to keep up with reality.
Dr. Bowring, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.